Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's SEEDS webinar on developing principles as instructional leadership. Before we begin, here are a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are some application widgets you can use. You can expand each widget by clicking on the maximize icon in the top right or by dragging the bottom right corner of the widget panel. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available one day after the webcast using the same audience link. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the resource list widget. It's a green folder at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for presenters during the Q&A session, hit the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. We will try to address as many questions as possible during the webcast. We do capture all questions. If you have technical difficulties, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon that covers common technical issues. Now I'd like to pass it over to Jeff Archer. Jeff, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Brian, and hello to everyone. As of now, it looks like about 33 people have signed on for the webinar, so thank you all for choosing to spend your hour with us, and it looks like more are still logging in. Yes, my name is Jeff Archer. I'm the president of Knowledge Design Partners, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. But before we get into the substance, we'd like to do a couple things. One is learn a little bit more about who's joined the webinar. So you at this point should be looking at on your screen a poll that we put together listing different audience types. And if you could take 1 minute to fill that out, that will help us understand who's on the call, and we'll report back on the information in another minute. So as you can see, the options are state education agency, school district, regional education agency, charter school or network, professional development provider, education preparation program, federal education agency, international education organization, education research organization, or other agency or organization. So if you could just take 1 minute to fill that out, and we'll go silent for that time, and then come back and begin with the webinar. Okay, thanks so much. As you can see, we've got a good number of folks on the line from state education agencies and school districts, professional development providers, and a good number from international education organizations and research organizations. So thank you so much. We'll keep that in mind as we move forward and try to direct the webinar questions towards the audiences that we know are there. So let's go to the next slide to give a little bit of background on this webinar series. This webinar is part of a series of activities for sharing lessons learned from grantees in the SEED program. SEED was started 6 years ago by the Office of Innovation and Improvement in the U.S. Department of Education. The program's purpose is to support educator effectiveness initiatives with evidence of success in increasing the number of highly effective teachers and principals. And grantees may be either national education groups or higher ed institutions. And I should mention that a new competition for another round of the grants was just announced on OII's website last month. So if that's of interest, you should check that out. Importantly, a major goal of the SEED program is for grantees to share their insights about improving educator effectiveness with the field writ large. And the three groups shown at the bottom of this slide are working together to support that dissemination, which includes organizing this webinar series. So let's go to the next slide for a little information on what's to come in the next 45 minutes or so. So in today's webinar, we have, we're super fortunate to have two guests with many insights to share about developing principals into instructional leaders. We have Stephanie Mosqueda from the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching. And Stephanie will be talking about NIAC's LIFT program. And we also have Edward Chevalier from the National Institute for School Leadership. And Edward will be talking about NISL's Executive Development Program. As you'll hear, both of the programs share a number of common features, in particular the fact that they both are extended programs taking place over a year or more, and they both have a heavy emphasis on building the capacity of school leaders to assess and improve the instruction in their buildings. But you'll also hear how these two programs reflect a variety of structures and methods for building that capacity. Last on the format we're going to have, this is going to take the form of a panel discussion. Stephanie and Edward will both briefly talk about their programs and some of the lessons they've learned about building instructional leadership from them. And then we'll use about half the time of our webinar to take questions from you, which you can do via the chat mode, the Q&A mode on the platform that you joined us with. And we will be reviewing those questions and using them to form the discussion, the basis of the discussion for the second half of the webinar. So with that brief intro out of the way, let's turn to the next slide. And I will turn the microphone over to Stephanie Mosqueda from NIAC. Stephanie?
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like this is an honor to be able to be a part of this process, and I always love opportunities like this because I feel like I learn just as much from everyone on participating on the webinar as perhaps maybe even the information I'm sharing. So I really appreciate this. As you can see on the slide here in front of us, there is some information and background on the National Institute for Excellence in Teaching as well as myself. Historically, NIAT started with the history of TAP, where they used a comprehensive transformation model, if you will, to impact schools and across the nation. And through those lessons learned, we've had the opportunity to apply for some of these seed grant opportunities, use those lessons learned and things that we have determined are important. And that is what led us to how this seed project, teacher leadership for instruction, has been developed as a part of the LIFT program. So Leadership Instruction for Teachers. I'll get it right in just a second. It is a 15-month intensive job-embedded opportunity to grow future principals. It is very much enriched in an internship, and we will kind of go deeper into that as we move through the next few slides. We could change slides, please. Okay, so as you'll notice here, there are 6 competencies that we have used to develop future principals. They are anchored in the ISLIC standards. Instructional leadership is going to be kind of one of our main focuses for that we share today, and how we've worked to address that to build the capacity of our future principals. And this definition of instructional leadership, just to kind of anchor us in, this is my definition. This is not from any particular individual. This is more just based on my experience over the years working with principals across the nation and different schools at varying levels. So I just wanted to share that this would be kind of where my viewpoint comes whenever you hear some of the discussion moving forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, here are the major components that serve as the centerpiece which is the actual experience that the principal fellow is having. Over this 15-month period, they follow the school calendar, and they are supported through various trainings, regular virtual coursework, as well as supported by a principal coach that is also their university professor in this undergrad or in this graduate level work, And the principal or the mentor principal of the host school serves as a model for helping this principal through this process over the course of a year. So as you can imagine, it's like a year-long student teaching experience for a teacher, but instead we're focusing here on a future principal. Next slide, please. These are our 5 major projects that kind of are continued over the course of the school year. And we're going to pull out one of these, which is the POP cycle. And what that stands for is pre-conference, observation, and post-conference. And principal fellows actually complete 4 of these cycles over the course of the year. And they are, their goal is to provide structured feedback for teachers and really hone in on that instructional leadership competency that we're working for. And next slide, please. Here's what you can see what I just explained about the pre-conference, observation, and post-conference. As I mentioned, there are 4 cycles, and the goal here during this process is twofold. One of the things we're tracking through the SEED experience is the growth of the teacher over time. The other piece that we are tracking is the characteristics of these principal fellows, future principals, to be strong instructional leaders and have that ability to provide effective feedback to teachers on instruction, as well as grow these teachers over time. So the 2 ways, aside from training, that we do this is by videotaping the pre-conference and the post-conference opportunities, and those serve as actual graded assignments that go toward their assigned grades for their coursework. Next slide, please. You will notice here is the framework for how these pre- and post-conference observations are structured. This gives us the ability for the fellows to have guidance on the front end. So first of all, they are trained very intensively on the onset, as well as during their summer 1 coursework. And then we continue that training over the course of time based on getting them to a state of true reflection in how they are following this framework. Next slide, please. So how we facilitate that reflection and giving them feedback so they can improve on their skills are the use of rubrics that have been developed to help the principal fellow understand how they are following the framework, and this also, again, serves as their grade. This is not a one-time thing that they get in terms of, the training. That happens at the very beginning. They can actually use whichever rubric that for teacher evaluation that the districts are using. In this case, you can see an excerpt from our NIAC rubric as if that were to be used. There are ways that we also connect this if they are using something else as perhaps a part of their state evaluation system. However, you can see how we make it a focus for them, making sure they understand where the students are in the process, how they're going to be learning that day. And we continue this training through the ongoing feedback that they get. They also receive site visits from the principal coaches as well as their NIAT project director. And the feedback that they're getting on top of the grade itself they are also having opportunities throughout the year embedded in that instructional leadership competency to be trained on work by great coaches or instructional coaches such as Jim Knight's work, as well as they watch exemplary models of the pre-conference and the post-conference in order to continue to coach and grow the principal fellow. Next slide, please. So although we just kind of pulled out one particular aspect due to the time nature that we had available for today, we do have some overall lessons learned within this project. We are now entering into our 4th cohort of fellows. We're looking to have at least 19 starting this coming summer, which is very exciting. But here's some lessons learned. So we really want to be sure that that role of the principal fellow when they're in this internship, that their responsibilities are anchored in the fact that they are still learning, so they are in learning mode. They are not just one more principal or assistant principal in the building, but they really need to have their role protected so that they can stay in that learner stance and follow kind of a gradual release of responsibility where they start out perhaps observing, then they support by facilitating, and then perhaps they're observed and given some feedback on these various aspects of their responsibilities and competencies. It's really important to carefully consider how the principal mentors that these interns are assigned, how they are selected. There is a process we use for an application and a vetting process within the district to be sure we have some very high quality principal mentors and that the districts endorse them. We also encourage the fact that we need to prioritize orientation and check-in with the principal mentors, and that leads to the principal mentors also benefiting from the experience. Some of the qualitative feedback we have gotten from this has been the fact that we have been able to hear from the principal mentors and how much they're actually learning alongside the fellows. So even though these are considered strong principal mentors, they're still gaining some benefit out of our lessons learned. And then last but not least, the importance of video capture and that regular feedback in order to develop the future principal's skills in that particular area, because we know that as we're facilitating a building and, you know, there's the managerial side as well as the instructional side, this is really a good opportunity to develop their instructional leadership. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a great overview. I know it was quick, and we should have plenty of time during the Q&A if people have questions about any of the issues or slides that you discussed. And I want to say thank you for those of you who have already submitted some questions. We're reviewing those now, and we'll get to those in the second half of the webinar. Encourage those who have not yet submitted questions to use the Q&A feature. If you scroll down to the bottom of your platform, I believe that's where you should see it. Meantime, let's turn to Edward Chevalier of the National Institute for School Leadership to hear about the Executive Development Program. Edward?
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm excited to be here. I'm especially excited because I am currently on a break from our newest cohort that we just started yesterday in Southern California. So I come to this webinar and this discussion with their questions and insights kind of fresh on my mind as they get into our program. As you can see on the slide, we're an organization. Our parent organization is the National Center on Education and the Economy. The signature initiative that we have is focused on our executive development program, where we work with school leaders, whether that be principals, assistant principals. This particular cohort happens to have the superintendent of the district that's participating in the cohort, but as we work with them. On our website, you'll find our vision statement, and that lead sentence of that vision statement is that we believe very strongly that we want at a minimum for high school graduates to graduate ready to succeed in a 2- or 4-year college or technical program that prepares them for both work and further education. But to make that happen, we strongly believe that the way to achieve that is through successful educational leadership. We're currently have cohorts in about 20 to 25 states. We have cohorts in all areas, urban, suburban, rural, as well as different levels of the socioeconomic spectrum. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Pictured on this slide is kind of a guide that we use throughout our program and around which our curriculum is organized. Our program philosophy and program curriculum is taken from educational field, but it's also from a business and a military perspective. What you see here is these 3 boxes because those outline our goal of helping our participants become strategic thinkers. We feel that it's extremely important that participants develop the capacity to bridge the gap between what their current context is and what their vision is for where they want their schools to be. And in order to do that, as a strategic thinker, it's important that they outline a strategy to operationalize that vision and where they want to go with it. Our whole design is based on the fact that we want to help our participants be proactive problem solvers. We don't propose, suggest, or have any idea that we can give them a silver bullet that they can use to make something happen. It's important that they be able to do that by analyzing carefully that context in which they currently exist and then establishing a vision for moving in that direction. Next slide, please. You still see the 3 boxes at the top of this slide, but on this slide, you see the different components that we feel are a part of this notion or this idea of instructional leadership. What I would point out to you, whether you look at that definition holistically or whether you look at it in those components in isolation, for each one of those, we work with our participants for them to, again, analyze the context in which they exist relating to that area or to that definition, and then establish a vision for where they want to go, further operationalizing the strategy for getting there. Many of our participants, as they look at this definition and kind of do a self-analysis of their own strengths, might find one of those areas of instructional leadership as being an area that they would target for growth, while they may look at another area and say, yeah, I feel pretty strongly about that, and here's my evidence for why I feel strongly related to it. Next slide, please. I realize there's a lot of words on this page, but I want to focus you on 2 or 3 things. This is an overview of the curriculum of our program. That box sits at the bottom with the 3 columns, Course 1, Course 2, and Course 3. As you look at Courses 1 and 2 and you see the types of things that we address in those 2 courses, we kind of think of those first 2 courses as things that we need to consider that are important to change. And then as we look at Course 3 is a focus on participants beginning to think about, okay, how do I change it? How do I actually make those changes? Our curriculum is a 12-unit curriculum. It's spread out over 12 to 15 months. It's pretty intensive. Participants participate for 2 full days every month, so we ask them to give up quite a bit of time. But we also have pre-work, pre-readings that they do so that they can come prepared for discussion. It's very much a facilitated discussion. It's not a lecture-based program. On that right-hand side, you see some of the instructional methods that we use in our program, Socratic seminars, text-based reading. The bottom 2 are extremely important to us. One is case studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But the other one, that bottom bullet, we ask our participants to identify an area of focus or a target area and develop an action learning project around that. To guide their development of that project, we go back to that strategic thinking framework of analyzing your context, establishing or developing a vision for where you want to go, and then developing a strategy for how you want to operationalize that. This project is not intended to be something that is necessary, that its completion coincides with the completion of the 12 units. It could, but it doesn't have to. Our focus is more for them to consistently and continuously analyze where they want to go, so that they can continue to help their students be better prepared to function once they successfully as citizens once they graduate. We can go to the next slide. What you see on this slide is an outline of that case study method, and again, there's a lot of words, so I want to focus you on the two parts separately. On that left-hand side, our model is based on the case study method that's used in the Harvard Business School and now in other schools across at Harvard and universities across the country. Our case studies that we use, we don't come with a preconceived idea of how to solve an issue. We want participants to look at the case. We want them to analyze it. We want them to analyze the facts in that case. We want them to realize that there are questions that they may have about that case that we simply don't have the answer to, much as they would encounter in their own daily situations. But the big thing that we want to do is push them to analyze that context to identify a challenge. We don't try to get them to any right answer. One of the challenges that we have in facilitating a case study is when we ask participants to discuss the case in small groups, we might have one group that identifies one problem in the case and another group may identify a completely separate problem, and that's okay. You see on the right-hand side the process that we use. Beginning with that individual step, we ask them to do some pre-readings, to come to the cohort prepared to discuss this, because we don't, because of the intensity especially, we don't have time that we can say, okay, let's take 15, 20 minutes out of the day to read this. So we ask them to come prepared. Then we spend the bulk of a case study discussion in small group discussions. We give them 2 or 3 guiding questions, but we kind of let them take the discussion and analyze it and determine where they want to go with it. And then we spend the last few minutes of the case study discussion pulling them back together in a large group debrief to hear their analysis and to hear some of the things that they identify. Next slide, please. One of the examples of a case study, and we have cases that we look at in just about each of the 12 units, but one of them is Railside High School. Railside High School is a case that focuses on a high school math department, and we ask them to analyze that case through the lens of one of the resources that we use, and that's pictured on the right-hand side, the Education for Life and Work resource from the National Research Council. We ask them to look at the ideas that are proposed and suggested in that particular resource for how to raise student achievement, and ask them to analyze the case, Railside, through the lens of that, and what made that particular department successful, and what challenges might they consider that were not particularly addressed. While I'm on this slide, I also want to point out that our program uses a variety of resources. Some of those are developed in-house. Some of them are from our parent organization, the National Center on Education and the Economy. We have a number of research reports that are available on our website. For example, a couple of them, one is looking at principal preparation programs in high-performing countries. Another one is looking at professional learning systems in high-performing countries. But we use those. We use resources from the National Research Council. Education for Life and Work is one. We also look at the resource How People Learn. We can go to the next slide. Like Stephanie, we also pull back and consider what are some lessons that we learn through the program. One of the things, and you see those listed there, but one of the challenges that I find as I facilitate around the country is principals just need time to talk to each other. They need time to problem solve, but they need to be able to do that in a risk-free setting. It's really gratifying to watch our cohorts develop a professional learning community as they begin to be able to sit at tables and address these challenges and solve some of these problems similar to the ones that they encounter in cases. A second lesson is to help them realize, but also to help ourselves realize that the job of a school leader is really too big for one person. The discussion that we had this morning is that as we were talking to the participants in that cohort, the principal that they remember from their own school experience faced a whole different job structure and job challenges of a job than what they're facing today. And the notion of distributed responsibility is challenging in itself. And so we work with them to struggle through that and grapple through that whole thing. And then finally, and this probably needs to be the first one rather than the third one, but is the idea that we as school leaders have to understand the urgency of educating all students to compete in a global economy. The theme of equity is one that is introduced for us in Unit 1 and is driven through every one of our units because the phrase that we use is all for us actually means all, and we want to make sure that our participants walk away with that. Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, Edward. That was a great overview of the Executive Development Program. And we have gotten a good number of questions from participants, so thank you all. I want to let you know that you can continue to submit questions throughout the webinar, so don't hold back. This is your opportunity to ask about anything that you've heard about or other aspects of these programs. Let me start. Stephanie, I want to ask something that was posed in reference to your presentation. Edward talked about some of the resources that they use, like the books from the National Resource Council and some of the publications from National Center on Education and the Economy. Stephanie, you had mentioned as one Jim Knight's work, I believe, and I was wondering if you could talk about a couple of that might be one of them, of the books or resources that you have your fellows really dig into and kind of the value of those resources, and maybe even how you use them. I don't know if it's just a matter of assigning them and they have questions that I have to discuss, but can you talk a little bit about some of those resources that are used in your program?
Sure, of course. So, Jim Knight's work comes into play when they're doing a deeper unit on instructional coaching, as well as coupled with the Leverage Leadership resource by Bambrick Santoyo, who that has that section in the book on effective academic feedback. And so those are just a couple of the lists from the list of books that they include in their book studies. But the professors also pull many other resources in. They'll have articles from Guskey. They will, look at some other books like on equity in education. So I like that Edward brought that up. At the very beginning, they do an equity audit, and they use a resource that guides them through that. And so, that's kind of big picture. It's a lot of information, but yes, those are some of the few.
Also, Stephanie, since you brought it up, the equity audit, can you just say a little bit about what that is? Because that sounds like an important aspect of kind of how your program kicks off.
Yeah, it actually is, because it helps them to determine which teachers they're going to identify to conduct the 4 cycles of the pre-observation and post, the POP cycles on. It also allows them to identify the students that they're also going to be honing in on. So in the summer 1, we kick off with a week-long academy, and a part of that they're given some, for kind of set in advance, they're given the Leadership for Equity and Excellence book by Sherrick and Skyla. And that walks them through a process. Every principal walking into a new school, obviously one of the first things they do is do a deep dive into their data. However, this process allows them to look at it through an equity lens, where they are looking for not only patterns and trends overall with performance, but perhaps are there any discrepancies between our male students performing better than females? Are there a lot of them encountered that there were more referrals for their Hispanic males versus their Hispanic females. So that would be an issue of equity that they would want to address on the campus. Equally, they look at even ratios of staff. So is the makeup of my staff all Anglo and my demographics within my building are all African American? That could be a discrepancy in equity, depending on how the students are performing and maybe what are some interventions that they've done to, be sure that there is cultural responsiveness taking place on the campus. So that's kind of how it kicks off, and it starts the trend for how they then monitor data, identify the teachers that they're going to work with in conjunction with the principal mentor, as well as the individual students, one special ed and one ELL, that they are going to serve as an advocate for over the course of the 15 months. And this also helps them to set their main school goals. So it's got goals, interventions, critical success factors, and then a way to measure that at the end of each quarter. So it builds into everything. It's actually the starting activity they do.
Great. That's super helpful. Edward, while we're on kind of resources that are used in your program, there have been a number of questions, a lot of interest in the cases that you use. Some folks want to know kind of where do they come from? Do you does NISL develop those specifically for the program, or are they from other programs? And also, it might be interesting, are they all from education? And if not, why do you include a mix?
Actually, it is a mix. Some of those are, yes, developed by our organization, but we also use one case in particular that we use in one of the early units from the Harvard School of Education on Highland Elementary in Montgomery County, Maryland. We use Railside School that I mentioned earlier. We also use and a couple or three other school case studies. They're a combination of both written case studies as well as some video case studies. In fact, the one that we'll use this afternoon in the cohort that I'm in, that we're in Unit 1, happens to be a case that we had them read some preliminary information. There's two cases, and then this afternoon they'll discuss that, but they'll also see a video interview with the principals in both of those two situations. In addition to school case studies, we use some from outside of school. The Ford case study, one of the classic case studies from the Harvard Business School, we use in Unit 2 when we're getting deeply into the notion of strategic thinking. Also from the world of business, we use the Starbucks case study in a later unit, talking about transformation and transformation for change. And then we also use the Cuban Missile Crisis to look at decision-making models that were in play when that crisis was occurring.
Great. Oh, I don't know whether you can answer this. There were some questions about the case study, the Railside one, and the one you mentioned from Montgomery County. Are those the actual names of schools, or are these made anonymous?
As a part of the research, Railside High School, that is a name that was assigned for the case because it looks at the introduction of that case. It introduces 3 high schools that were in the same geographic vicinity, and so names were assigned to those schools for anonymity purposes. Highland Elementary, I believe, is actually the name of the school. Got it.
Great. Thank you. And Stephanie, there are a couple of questions about the logistics about the LIFT program. Can you clarify the fellows in that program? Are they since it's associated with Texas Tech University, are they also students at Texas Tech during this period?
Yes. So what the outcome is from the 15-month internship, it is basically taking a traditional master's in education leadership with a principal certification, and instead of it being, over the course of 2 or 3 semesters, and there being only a small amount of time for the field-based experience, it has taken all of that and condensed it into this 15-long-month experience where they are following the school calendar. Their assignments and reflections are aligned with just-in-time type assignments. So they start at the beginning when the school starts, and yes, there's an interview process. They go through that to be selected. Then they apply to the graduate school at Texas Tech, and through that they are in a graduate program that they finish in a little bit less time, as well as they get the rich experience of serving. Like I mentioned, the comparison would be like being a student teacher from day one till the end of the year, all the while taking ongoing classes and getting regular support. So their experience is just as if they were following that, that school year. At the end, they have a master's. They also take their certification test as a principal. We have also had some folks from outside of the state who, with reciprocity, they have been able to attend the courses because all of them, except for the very first week, is virtual. And so we have 3 in a different state, one of which has already passed her certification test in her state. And so it's not just specific to Texas. The way the program works aligned to the national ISLIC standards. So it's applicable even outside of Texas.
Great. One other question that I think was interesting that was raised that's relevant to similar programs that might be implemented in different contexts, and that has to do with what your principal fellows are kind of able to do as kind of quasi-supervisors. Is that kind of a bit of an issue? Like, while they're not an actual administrator in their school, they are doing these things as part of your program, like observing and providing feedback and leading professional learning communities. Does that involve any kind of negotiation with the districts and where they work? And do you have any thoughts about, like, would that be more difficult in states that have different, say, policies on who can do administrator type activities and who can't?
So great that you brought that up. These individuals are actually on a teacher contract. So they are still, because most of the folks that have applied for the program, they are either teacher leaders or they were classroom teachers. And so they continue on that same salary scale, but it's in the presentation to the staff by the principal mentor that they are a principal in training. And so they are giving feedback based on the evaluation tool, but that evaluation tool, those scores are not going against that individual teacher that they're coaching. It's a very transparent process where the teachers that they're working with are they understand that it is a coaching model, and so it is their opportunity, to grow over time. So in terms of, the negotiation process and that kind of thing, they're kept out of final decisions. They are sometimes excluded from some of the conversation, depending on the nature of the conversation, especially when it comes to perhaps a teacher that is on some kind of growth plan or an intervention plan. So, there are some limits as to what what they get exposed to. But all in all, they are living and breathing as an extension of the principal mentor, as a principal in training. And so everything they're doing, though, it does not, it still ultimately is the principal and assistant principal who are certified and qualified for that position in the district to handle, certain compliance and legal matters on the campus. I hope that answers the question.
Very well, thank you. Thank you. One question for you, Edward. Your program is quite large at this point, serves a lot of different principals, and as I understand it, in a lot of different situations, from those that are in already pretty high-performing schools to those that are serving really high-need populations, or maybe even the school is kind of in a turnaround need situation. If I'm correct in that, I'm curious how your program addresses the needs of all the people, regardless of the different kind of scenarios they might be going into.
Again, we create the opportunities for the conversation to occur. The clients that we work with obviously identify the folks that are going to be in that cohort. It is not unusual for us to be in an urban area where a district has brought us in or an agency has brought us in. But the discussions, and that's why we use things such as the case studies, because the case studies give our participants an opportunity to discuss challenges that a principal faced in kind of a risk-free environment, rather than bringing just their own challenges to the table. What we find is, there are some things that are unique to a situation, to a context, but there are other things, there are other challenges that are fairly consistent regardless of the context that they came from. We also, as we're facilitating cohorts, facilitators get to know their cohorts pretty well. And depending on what's going on as far as an activity or a discussion is concerned, we may group participants a particular way so that they may be with folks that face similar challenges, but we try to make sure that we blend that as much as possible. One of the things that I frequently find frustrating is, after I get to know a cohort pretty well, and this usually happens in one of the later units, I've asked a couple of times, when you go back to your own setting, do you have a professional learning community such as the one that you're experiencing now that's there in your home setting? And far too often the answer is no. So it challenges me as a facilitator to recognize the importance of creating those opportunities and structuring those opportunities for participants to learn from each other and work with each other as they look for ways to transfer that learning back to their own situation.
Great. And you actually provided a great segue to another question that a couple people have asked about kind of your observations and follow-up with participants after they complete your programs. First of all, to what extent are you able to track what they're able to do in terms of utilizing the competencies and capacities you've helped them build? But also, similar to what you just talked about, Edward, what sort of observations do you have about their ability to act as instructional leaders once they've completed your programs? Stephanie, do you have any observations, or could you say something about how you track the progress of your folks after they're done with the program?
Sure. So, and this is kind of what I've learned is contingent based on, the time of the actual project and the timeline. I also understand that that's a common concern, especially if you're trying to determine, is a school-level principal more effective than a school-level principal, perhaps, who went through a traditional model. And what I can say to that regard, that's a small piece of what we are tracking. So we are tracking their principal evaluation scores after the fact. However, what has become a challenge that I'm sure many of you can imagine, a lot of these folks are not moving straight into a principalship. They're moving into an assistant principalship or perhaps a school dean. Not very many have been assigned to district level, but we do have that where they've become district level administrators as well. So, the one thing that would be lovely is if we could track this even on a 7-year continuum and just to see maybe after the fact and if these folks do transition into a principalship, what the difference is and how that looks. But what we try to focus on is the nature of growth that's taking place. So I mentioned that they pick 2 case study students that they track and they advocate for, one of which being represented by special ed and one with an ELL background. And so they start by digging into their files and seeing maybe if something has been missed. Was this student identified appropriately for either program that they're receiving? And then they start to serve as an advocate for the quality of that. And so what we're looking for over the course of the 15 months is what has been the change in the growth of these students now that they've had this advocate / teacher coach where they are placed. We also track their PLC progress, so they also are assigned a PLC that they facilitate and attend and track over the course of the year. And so how collectively is that PLC performing on student performance tests? Are we seeing growth? Is that different from maybe how another PLC who didn't have a principal fellow in this role, there? Equally, we're looking at their progress over time on how they increase their feedback, so their grades on those POP cycles using those rubrics, as well as the performance of the teachers they're coaching over the 4 cycles. And so, we're trying to focus on the growth aspect of it. But yes, that is something that, a pie in the sky world, everything with the stars would align and that would work out just, nicely. However, with the trajectory of a typical principalship, they don't move right on into that role. So that's how we're handling it with this SEED project.
Jeff, if I could piggyback on that.
Please do.
This is Edward. If I could piggyback on that related to our program too, and some of the things Stephanie said triggered my thinking on this. In addition to our study, our SEED associated with the SEED grant, we've got studies related to student performance at some of the other districts and areas in which we've worked. But another side of that coin, as you talk about follow-up and next steps, at the urging of many of our participants, they've completed the 12 units and said, okay, what next? I don't want this to stop. We've been pushed and encouraged and are excited about some online programs and some follow-up courses that we're developing that participants can choose to take advantage of and choose to participate in, that allows them to continue the professional learning community that they develop in the face-to-face cohort. We've also had some of the areas that we work with us to continue a relationship after we complete, whether it be quarterly or one or 2 times a year, so that they can continue their learning, but continue the structure that they've come to appreciate through the cohort.
And probably addresses what you talked about, is that the need for principals to have a safe space to talk with each other.
Right.
About the challenges they're encountering. It makes a lot of sense. I want to ask a couple more questions about the core kind of examples of instructional, how you build capacity in instructional leadership that you talked about. So Stephanie, video plays a big part in the LIFT program, and I think there's a lot of talk in the field about the need for video libraries, the need to videotape, record teachers' instruction and use that in some way. Can you talk about the value of that in the LIFT program, that you use these videos in terms of building these aspiring principals' competencies. And do you have any kind of advice for groups that maybe are thinking about how do we actually use video to try to build the instructional leadership competencies of principals?
Sure. I would say my first bit of advice would be don't make it an event, a checklist, something that I just have to do to get the grade. Take it beyond that and use it as a building block to shape the overall instructional leadership of that fellow. So what I mean by that is our principal coaches, who are also their university professors for various courses, they get one coach that they're assigned from start to finish. And some of the strategies, as well as my role, has been to really take that first pre-conference and post-conference video, we watch it ourselves. We also then have a subsequent debrief conversation with them, aside and apart from the feedback they get from the professor that is scoring that and using those rubrics. So I think also, as we're on, the conversation doesn't end with that feedback in the grade. It's an ongoing part of the conversation to really address, what part of that are you struggling with? So the second piece of advice would be the structure, and that's kind of what I'm speaking to here. There needs to be a structure that's followed. We can't just anticipate or expect, and I've seen this happen before, which it blows my mind, but sometimes I think we just say, hey, okay, you're a new school leader. Let's just expect that you know exactly how to have a feedback session with the teacher. And some people actually say, go and set forth and do. And from a district perspective, and that's just very unfair, I think, to a principal. I know the first time I sat down, I didn't, but with a structure, I was able to follow that and keep my conversation focused and make sure it was truly a reflective dialogue and not the old way I used to give feedback by just simply saying, these are the areas you need to work on, here's some ideas I have, and then we go on. One of the crucial pieces of this framework is that model and the recommendation. So it's very evidence-based, and then the model and the recommendations should directly align with that, and it should always be anchored in some kind of research or best practice or recommended practice. So, that would be my take on that.
That's helpful. Edward, there have been more questions about the case study method, and one thing there I think folks are interested in is the facilitation of those case studies. You showed us on your slide about the individual reading, small group discussion, large group discussion, but am I correct that who facilitates those small and large group discussions, that how they go about that is really important to bringing about the kind of learning that you hope that those discussions achieve? And if so, how do you prepare those people to facilitate case study discussions?
The small group discussions, we provide the guiding question, but the discussion goes on within the group. We don't have an assigned facilitator for small groups because we want the discussion to be more free-flowing. My job as a facilitator, the job of any facilitator, is while those are going on, is to be walking around the room gathering information that will be used in turn during that large group discussion. The facilitator does facilitate that larger group discussion, but as we tell our facilitators that we're training, you do much more listening than you do talking as far as during the facilitation, because you want to know from participants what their thoughts are related to the challenges encountered by whoever that case is addressing or whoever that case is about. As far as how we train them, all of our folks that are facilitated, we have a cadre of national facilitators, but we also, some areas choose to go with a local facilitated model. In order for someone to facilitate the executive development program at all, they go through the full 12 units as a participant, and then we do a 6-day facilitation institute with them that involves practice facilitation. We address facilitation skills. We address the resources of our program. And then at the conclusion of that, we ask them to go back we video their practice facilitation. We ask them to go back and watch that video and do a reflection piece through the lens of the facilitator competencies that we've identified.
So interesting. The video, again, is used in your program as well around training the facilitators of the case studies. So we have quickly approached the end of the hour, and if we could go to the last slide, and I hope everybody joining can hang on just for one more minute. I want to say thanks so much to Stephanie and Edward for sharing with us some of the really useful insights from your work, and thank you to all you who joined the webinar, listened in, and submitted questions that made for a great discussion. If you're interested in those of you who have joined in, if you're interested in learning about additional opportunities, to learn lessons from other seed grantees, email Stephen Malik from Mathematica at the email address that's shown here. Last, I'll also say if you're interested in more information on any of the seed grantees, you'll find background on their seed projects on the website of the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Innovation and Improvement. And last, please make sure to complete the feedback form at the end of the webinar. It'll help us plan the next one, which hopefully will be even better. But thank you so much for your time, and this concludes the webinar today. Take care.
Thank you.